broadly speaking, pardons were sorted out into two kinds. There's the de cursu pardon, which is, yeah, of course you get a pardon. I mean, it literally means of course, de cursu. And that's for, like, self-defense killings, for example. And then there are pardons of grace, de gratia. And then of the de gratia pardon, so Satan is obviously not eligible for a de cursu pardon, right? Insofar as he wants a pardon, it's got to be one of these de gratia pardons. And those are divided into two kinds. There's the collective ones, and then there's the individual ones. And the collective ones are known as acts of grace. So that when Satan is thinking, might I obtain an act of grace, and when Milton capitalizes it, I think he makes it very clear that he's talking about the sort of group pardon. The nice thing from Satan's standpoint about a collective act of grace is you don't have to ask for it. This would be like, you know, the monarch would say, I hereby pardon all people with brown hair who were 5'4", who got a parking ticket last year, and I can go, oh, thank heavens, that applies to me. You know, I go down to Court of Chancery, I pay a nominal fee, and I get it, you know, ratified. What's fun for me in doing this research, I haven't found anybody who's ever called attention to the fact that Milton is actually using a legal term here, and that the capitalization is sort of putting it in neon, like, you know, really, I do mean act of grace. But I think in the second part of the passage, Milton is really talking about the other kind of pardon, right? Which is the one that you had to beg for yourself. Okay, the individual. Because where he says, is there no place left for repentance, none for pardon left, none left but by submission. That sort of suggests he's thinking about the individual pardon, because the single feature of that pardon is complete and abject submission. Over and over again, you get people using the word submission. I submit, I submit. No, I really unconditionally, wholeheartedly submit. Over and over again. So in what follows, I want to point to 4 mistakes that I think Satan is making in his approach to this sort of individual de gratia pardon. In other words, Satan can't be pardoned not because as an angel he lies outside the reach of divine mercy, but rather because he's going about the process in completely the wrong way. In other words, I want to think about the idea that maybe the problem here is procedural and not theological. And for each mistake that Satan makes, Milton's going to be really careful to show Adam and Eve getting it right later on in the epic. So Satan's first mistake is geography. All right, so these are sort of Chapman's rules of pardoning. One is you ask for pardon in the place where you were sentenced. This is part of the very, highly symbolic vocabulary of early modern pardoning, and also early modern executing, because those two are very tightly linked. I'll give you one example. I love this pamphlet. This is the true narrative of the execution of John Marketman, surgeon. You see there with surgeon the kind of flexible 17th century spelling. Both of my children would have done really well in that world. John Marketman is the ship's surgeon. He's been on a year-long cruise. He comes home to find his wife pregnant and stabs her in a rage, flees town, is caught, dozens and dozens of miles away, put on trial, and we found there he was committed to the county jail at Chelmsford, and there at the last assizes received a just judgment of condemnation and was ordered to be hanged at the common place of execution in Chelmsford. But he, on his bended knees, did beg as his last request of the judge that he might be brought to the town where he did perpetrate this wicked act, there to be executed according to his sentence, which was granted. And in fact, the judges took some effort and expense to transport him back to his home, and they built a scaffold right beside his house. And his mother got up there and made this sort of impassioned speech. She wasn't even asking for clemency, really. So it was generally, he was sort of loved for the fact that he wanted to go home to be hanged. You see this same logic with pardons. A lot of people who were sentenced by Star Chamber, which is one of the main courts, would wait until the king was in session in Star Chamber before coming in and throwing themselves to the ground and begging pardon. Satan, however, has gotten this all wrong, right? Because he's asking for pardon when he's landed on Earth. Earlier in the journey, he would have had the right moment. He sort of landed in Book 3 at the bottom of these mystical stairs that lead up to Heaven's Gate. Like, that would have been the right time if he really wanted a pardon to sort of entertain the question. So I think the very fact of where he's choosing his ground signals that he's really not serious about this. And Milton contrasts this with Adam and Eve. These are 3 places in Book 10 where Adam and Eve, the fall happens in Book 9, and in Book 10, Adam and Eve finally kind of get their act together and say, oh, maybe we should apologize. And so in 3 places, Milton uses some version of the phrase, to the place of judgment. Eve says, to the place of judgment we'll return. Adam says, what better can we do than to the place repairing where he judged us? And then the narrator says, they forthwith to the place repairing where he judged them. I haven't seen many people commenting on the fact that passage 2 almost exactly replicates passage 3. Either Milton kind of took a nap, or he really wanted to emphasize the importance of the place here. All right, second mistake, selfishness. Ask pardon for your followers. This is a big one. According to the sort of paternalist and hierarchical worldview that's still very dominant in the 17th century, leaders, fathers, especially military commanders, which Satan is, are expected to first seek clemency for those under their command. In the 16th century, we have the Duke of Northumberland, who was executed for treason, and his main concern was to try to get a pardon for his sons and nephews and such, who had allied with him. In the 17th century, Hugh O'Neill is the Earl of Tyrone, who led the Irish in the 9 Years' War to throw off Elizabethan rule. He's captured at the Battle of Kinsale, and a sort of long series of negotiations in which he's trying to sue out his pardon, and he's primarily doing that with the understanding that if he gets a pardon, it automatically extends to all the men who fought with him. In contrast, let's look again at Satan's self-interest. He says, such joy ambitions finds, but say I could repent and could obtain by active grace my former state. Right? So very absorbed with his own question of pardon. We can contrast this with what Mammon says in Book 2. I mean, I've already shown you this, but we'll revisit it. He says, suppose he, God, should relent and publish grace to all on promise made of new subjection. With what eyes could we stand in his presence humble? So Mammon's more aware of that general pardon, but when it kind of filters into Satan's consciousness, it becomes a self-only pardon. So from this standpoint, Satan can't be pardoned simply because he's not willing to entertain the idea of a pardon for others. And then here we have Adam and Eve. Both, Adam is saying to Eve, I wish I could go, right, and get all the penalty on my head so that you could be forgiven. And then in soliloquy, he's talking to his former sons in the second passage. He says, oh, were I able to waste, i.e. all the penalty, myself and leave you none. So Adam and Eve are kind of getting that piece of things correct. All right, rule 3, Satan's third mistake is isolation. You have to find an intercessor who will make your case for you. All right. The biggest obstacle that fugitives and prisoners faced in their quest for pardons was really not poverty or a hostile legal system, but rather isolation from the proper social channels. And in fact, one historian argues very convincingly that suing out pardons was a crucial piece of what he calls the currency of patronage in the period, and so that requests for pardons and granting pardons and helping other people get pardons is a part of the sort of social glue that's holding English culture together. I've given you 2 examples. I love the second one, William Shafto. So a 16th century and a 17th century example. Both Hugh Park and William Shafto convicted of homicide. William Shafto, he writes to his brother Michael Shafto, who wrote to Sir Henry Percy, who wrote to the Earl of Essex, who presented his petition to the king. Right, and so it goes up that way, and then the pardon that trickles comes back is down that way. So it sort of creates these channels of these sort of networking channels. So Satan's problem then is, who would he ask to be his intercessor? He has completely isolated himself at this point in the epic. I mean, we know that he outranks almost everybody. So he doesn't have some other angel he could say, you go intercede on my behalf. In Book 3, he's described himself as alone and thus wandering, and Milton constantly returns to images of aloneness and solitude, bad solitude, when talking about Satan. And so I think what Milton is pointing at is that the only possible intercessor for Satan would be the Son, right, i.e. God's Son. We can't call him Jesus because he doesn't become Jesus until he becomes a human. So this is way back. So he's called the Son in Paradise Lost. And it's as if Satan kind of half knows this, because at the beginning of his soliloquy, he starts talking to the Son, S-U-N. Right? He said, this is the first line of his soliloquy. O thou that with surpassing glory crowned looks from thy sole dominion like the God of this new world, at whose sight all the stars hide their diminished heads. To thee I call, but with no friendly voice, and add thy name, O Son. Right? So he's looking to the wrong intercessor here. This is in contrast to Adam and Eve. Adam is very clear. He says to Eve in Book 10, remember with what mild and gracious temper he, the Son, both heard and judged without wrath or reviling. And so, we should go apologize to him. He's the intercessor. They will go and pray at the end of Book 10, and then here's the narrator at the beginning of Book 11 describing the fruits of those prayers. To heaven their prayers flew up, nor missed the way by envious winds blown vagabond or frustrate. In they passed, dimensionless through heavenly doors, then clad with incense, where the golden altar fumed by their great intercessor, came in sight before the Father's throne. Them the glad Son presenting thus to intercede began. Most discussions of this passage talk about the way Milton is rewriting the passages in Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, that talks about Jesus as the high priest, and certainly that imagery is there. But I think with the images of things coming into the throne room and a kind of aristocrat presenting petitions to a father in an intercessory way, that's exactly the protocols that happened when people brought, when a duke brought petitions for pardon in before the monarch. And then Satan's the fourth and last mistake I'll talk about is overreaching. You just don't expect too much. There's almost no such thing as a free pardon in the period. I mean, very rarely if it was obviously an erroneous verdict, you could be pardoned and you could go absolutely back the way you were. But I'd say 95% of the time, pardons carried some degree of forfeiture. You paid a lot of money to get your pardon, or you forfeited half of your estates to the crown. Those are both very common. And that even on the rare occasion when you did have free pardons, there's always the understanding that you're on a much shorter leash afterwards. And Mammon, we've seen this passage before, but Mammon's aware of this. When he says, suppose he, God, should relent and publish grace to all on promise made of new subjection, with what eyes could we stand in his presence humble and receive strict laws imposed? Mammon's very aware, like let's say we did get a pardon and could go back to heaven, we'd have a whole bunch of new stricter laws imposed on us. And this is Mammon is articulating a much more realistic understanding of the consequences of a pardon. We can contrast this with what Satan says. Say I could obtain by act of grace my former state. Say I could go right back to being the way I was. I think 17th century readers would have known that this is wildly unrealistic. The other thing is, it's possible, from one standpoint, Satan's already gotten a pardon, which is that he hasn't, this is sort of thin ice here, but he's been driven out to hell. And one critic has sort of argued that hell is like a penal colony. So what has actually happened, Satan has been evicted and sent to work in, God's version of Botany Bay. But what the crucial distinction to realize there is nobody was actually sentenced to be transported in Milton's period. They were sentenced to death and then given a conditional pardon on, then the condition is their willingness to go work in wherever in the colonies. Ostensibly, they could have said, no, I'd rather be executed. So from that standpoint, if we do think of hell as like a penal colony, then Satan already has been pardoned, right? And so what we see in the soliloquy is that he just doesn't like the pardon he's gotten, and he wants a different one. This contrasts really interestingly with Adam and Eve in Book 10. Adam is very clear about knowing that they're not going to get to go back to being exactly as they were. Here he is talking to Eve, and he says, he's working his way up to the idea of apologizing. He says, he's talking about the son. His hands clothed us. They have clothing. Clothed us unworthy, pitying while he judged. How much more, if we pray him, will his ear be open and his heart to pity incline and teach us further by what means to shun the inclement seasons? He's not saying God's going to turn back time. He's just saying God's going to help us make the best of this sort of rough lot we've gotten ourselves into. And he even goes on and says, maybe we could get sticks and rub them and fire would come. And so what Adam really wants is, in the second passage, remedy or cure to evils which our own misdeeds have wrought. He will instruct us, praying. Adam seems to have a sort of a better, more limited understanding even of what a pardon could get them. Okay, conclusion. If I've been successful, you are at least half persuaded that Milton was familiar with early modern procedures for criminal pardon, and that at these key moments in Paradise Lost, he is thinking hard about both human and divine forms of justice and mercy. But what does this new context tell us? What does this say about the poet and thinker John Milton? Now here I'm going to be tentative because the answer to this question is the central argument, the larger argument I'm working on. There seems to have been, critically, a concerted attempt to keep Milton's head in the clouds. In other words, in the last few decades, there's a sort of grudging admission that, okay, maybe Milton didn't just read Virgil with his earplugs in all the time. But in general, the default position seems to want to say that, Milton is this Renaissance time capsule that's drifted into a restoration world. And if insofar as people say, okay, well, yeah, he's engaged with his own world, it's what he's only thinking about theology and politics, high politics. And this is sort of a premise that I want to challenge, because in my readings recently of Paradise Lost, it's been really clear to me that Milton is pervasively and deeply interested in the nature of crime. For example, he calls Satan an arch felon just a few lines after the soliloquy I've been leaning on. He also calls Satan a criminal. He's called a traitor. A little bit later in book 4, when Satan finally gets to the actual Garden of Eden, and he jumps the gates, jumps the hedge and lands on the inside, Milton sort of has a long aside likening him to a burglar climbing over the roof tiles. A little bit after that, he'll call him a grand thief, a phrase that has not been critically remarked on, but I think Milton there is convicting him of grand as opposed to petty larceny. And then a little bit later on, Milton will switch into using very, very specific poaching terminology that indicates that in addition to reading, the Odyssey, he's also been reading, technical manuals on forestry laws. So an interest in crime is sort of the great blank spot in Milton's study, as is law, for that matter. One of the few scholars who has written about Milton's remarkable familiarity with the law discusses his various experiences. Milton did a lot of litigation to recuperate debts with mortgages and such. And she mentions in a kind of dismissive aside that Milton's one brush with the criminal law came when he spent 3 months in prison after the Restoration. And then she sort of hurries back to say, but he mainly would have just known the civil law. So I have two objections here. One is that being arrested for treason and spending 3 months in the Tower of London is not a garden variety brush with the law, right? This is not, he was not picked up for shoplifting in Target. But the more serious issue is this critic, like so many others, is imposing an absolutely anachronistic understanding of the law in the early modern period. Our modern world is divided. The legal system is pretty well divided into civil and criminal law, and those are pretty watertight compartments. So you can have a deep experience with the civil law, right, and really not have had much of a brush with the criminal world. And those divisions simply did not exist in the 17th century. The same courts, the same judges handled civil and criminal cases. There is not that sort of juridical. That distinction is just rising into view in this period. So it's deeply anachronistic to point to Milton's familiarity with laws related to debts and mortgages and simultaneously try to insulate him from laws related to theft and homicide. So I think finally Milton critics don't like the idea that the learned poet who wrote stunning iambics about his goal to justify the ways of God to man was interested in something as sordid and perverse as crime. But here too they are thinking anachronistically, imposing a modern view backwards onto a world which thought very differently. One result of the secularization of crime in sort of the modern world is that criminals are often seen as deviants, as importantly different in key ways from law-abiding citizens, even if that difference is sort of socioeconomic. But the early modern world drew no distinction between crime and sin. Crime is sin, sin is crime. The only difference is that criminals, their sin happened to have also contravened human laws. So the image of Milton perusing pamphlets about criminals and executions, and I argue in other sections of this project that that's exactly what he did, and thinking hard about the procedures for criminal pardon, this is not evidence for the poet's somewhat prurient interest in a deviant sector of the English populace. Rather, Milton could turn to such pamphlets for the same reason that he turned to Roman history or to the Talmud or to the Bible, for evidence of how what he calls man's first disobedience had been replicated over and over in human history. Thanks.